Hey guys, tonight we venture into something truly ancient, something carved into clay tablets thousands of years before the pyramids rose from the Egyptian sand. We're going to talk about beings that have fascinated scholars, theologians, and curious minds for generations. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. What I want to explore with you is one of the oldest mysteries preserved in human writing, a story of powerful beings who descended from the heavens, taught humanity forbidden knowledge, and ultimately paid a terrible price for their transgression. These beings have many names across different traditions. In the Sumerian texts, they were called the Anunnaki. In later Hebrew tradition, they became known as the Watchers or the Grigori. Their individual names survive in crumbling manuscripts and ancient tablets, names that carry power and meaning even after millennia of silence. Tonight, we're going to explore those names, understand what each one meant, and discover what powers these beings allegedly possessed. The story begins in ancient Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the Sumerians created one of humanity's first great civilizations. They invented writing, they built the first cities, and they left behind thousands of clay tablets covered in cuneiform script. On those tablets, they recorded their myths, their laws, their medical knowledge, and most importantly for our purposes tonight, their beliefs about the gods who walked among them. These weren't abstract deities living in some distant heaven. According to the Sumerian texts, these beings interacted directly with humanity. They established cities, they appointed kings, they taught skills and sciences, and some of them, according to later traditions that built upon these Sumerian foundations, crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. What makes this topic so endlessly fascinating is the way it connects different cultures and time periods. The Sumerian stories about the Anunnaki influenced Babylonian mythology. Those Babylonian accounts then influenced Hebrew traditions during the Babylonian exile. The Hebrew traditions gave us the Book of Enoch and the story of the Watchers, and those stories continued to evolve through early Christian writings, Islamic traditions, and countless esoteric schools of thought. So tonight we're going to trace those connections. We'll start with the earliest Sumerian sources, work our way through the various traditions, and examine the names and powers attributed to these mysterious beings. Some of what we'll discuss comes from canonical religious texts. Some comes from apocryphal writings that various religious authorities have rejected over the centuries, and some comes from ancient Mesopotamian tablets that predate any Abrahamic religion. I want to be clear about something from the start. We're exploring mythology and ancient belief systems tonight. I'm not here to tell you what to believe or to make claims about what's historically true versus what's religious allegory. What I am here to do is present the information as it appears in these ancient texts, to explain what scholars have learned about these traditions, and to let you draw your own conclusions about what it all means. With that said, let's travel back in time, roughly 6,000 years, to the fertile plains of ancient Sumer. The world's first cities are rising from the mud. Writing is being invented for the first time in human history, and on countless clay tablets, scribes are recording stories about beings who came down from the heavens to shape the destiny of mankind. The journey we're about to take crosses the boundaries of religion, mythology, history, and archaeology. We'll encounter texts written in languages that have been dead for millennia, translated by scholars who spent lifetimes deciphering ancient scripts. We'll meet beings with strange names and stranger powers, figures who haunted the imagination of ancient peoples and continue to fascinate us today. Some of what I'll share tonight may challenge assumptions you hold about the ancient world. The connections between different civilizations run deeper than many people realize. Ideas and stories traveled along trade routes, were carried by refugees and conquerors, and evolved as they moved from culture to culture. The beings we call Watchers didn't emerge from nowhere. They grew from older traditions that themselves built on even older foundations. I should also mention that scholars disagree about many aspects of what we'll discuss. The interpretation of ancient texts is difficult work, and reasonable experts can reach different conclusions from the same evidence. Where there's scholarly consensus, I'll try to represent it fairly. Where there's debate, I'll try to present the various positions. My goal is to give you the most accurate picture I can of these ancient traditions. One more thing before we begin. The beings we're discussing tonight, the Watchers and their Mesopotamian predecessors, were taken very seriously by the people who wrote about them. These weren't entertaining fictions to the ancient authors. They were explanations for how the world came to be the way it is. The suffering and evil that humans experience, the knowledge and skills that enable civilization, the presence of spiritual forces both good and evil, all of these had their origins in the events we're about to explore, at least according to the ancient sources. Whether you approach this material as religious truth, as cultural mythology, or simply as fascinating ancient literature, I hope you'll find tonight's journey as compelling as I do. The questions these texts grapple with, about the nature of good and evil, about the relationship between divine and human realms, about the costs and benefits of knowledge, remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. The cradle of civilization, Sumer and its texts. To understand the Watchers and their true names, we first need to understand where these stories originated. The Sumerians emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, sometime around 4500 BCE. By around 3500 BCE, they had developed one of the most remarkable inventions in human history, the written word. Using a reed stylus pressed into soft clay tablets, they created cuneiform script, humanity's first true writing system. These tablets have survived for thousands of years, preserved by the very fire that often destroyed the buildings where they were kept. When ancient cities burned, the clay tablets inside hardened like pottery, ironically preserving them for future generations to discover. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of thousands of these tablets from sites across Iraq, and many more undoubtedly remain buried beneath the sand. The Sumerians were obsessed with record keeping. They documented everything from grain transactions to royal decrees, from medical prescriptions to love poems. But among the most fascinating documents they left behind are their religious texts, the myths and hymns that reveal what they believed about the cosmos, about death, and about the gods who ruled over them. The Sumerian pantheon was vast and complex. At its head sat An, or Anu, in the later Akkadian language, the god of the heavens and father of the gods. Below him were the great gods who ruled various domains. Enlil controlled the air and the earth, making him effectively the king of the gods in many traditions. Enki, also known as Ea in Akkadian, was the god of fresh water, wisdom, magic, and creation. These three formed what scholars call the supreme Mesopotamian triad. But beyond these major deities, the Sumerians believed in a vast assembly of divine beings called the Anunna or Anunnaki. The name itself is revealing. It likely derives from the Sumerian words meaning those of princely seed, or those who came from Anu. In other words, these were the children or descendants of the great sky god, beings of royal divine lineage who held power over various aspects of existence. The earliest texts describe the Anunnaki as heavenly beings with immense powers. In the poem Enki and the World Order, the Anunnaki pay homage to Enki, singing hymns in his honor and taking up dwellings among the people of Sumer. The same composition states twice that the Anunnaki decree the fates of mankind. This is a crucial detail. These weren't minor spirits or nature demons. They were beings who determined human destiny itself. One text mentions as many as 50 Anunnaki associated with the city of Eridu, Enki's sacred city and possibly the oldest city in Sumer. Other traditions speak of hundreds or even thousands of these beings. In the Babylonian creation epic known as the Enuma Elish, the god Marduk commands some 600 Anunnaki, directing 300 to reside in the heavens and 300 to reside on earth. The Sumerians believed these deities lived in temples within their sacred cities. Each major city had its patron god or goddess whose temple formed the center of urban life. The deity was thought to literally reside within the temple, represented by a cult statue that was fed, clothed, and honored as if it were the god's physical body. Priests served these statues constantly, and the welfare of the city was believed to depend on keeping its divine patron satisfied. But there's another group of beings in Mesopotamian mythology that becomes particularly relevant to our discussion of the Watchers. These were the Igigi, sometimes spelled differently in various texts, who appear in many sources as a distinct class from the Anunnaki. The relationship between these two groups is complex and somewhat confusing, even in the ancient sources, which shouldn't surprise us. The Mesopotamian religious tradition evolved over thousands of years across multiple cultures. In some texts, Igigi seems to have the same meaning as Anunna, referring generally to the great gods. But in other texts, particularly the famous Atrahasis epic, the Igigi are clearly distinguished as a younger or lesser group of gods who served the Anunnaki. And it's in this context that we find one of the most important stories for understanding the Watchers tradition, the rebellion of the Igigi. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on cuneiform tablets dating back to around 1700 BCE, tells how the Anunnaki, the great gods, forced the Igigi, the lesser gods, to do backbreaking labor. The Igigi had to dig canals, maintain the irrigation systems, and perform all the hard physical work that the Anunnaki didn't want to do themselves. For 40 years, according to the text, the Igigi suffered under this burden. Then they rebelled. The Igigi gathered together, set fire to their tools, and surrounded the house of Enlil by night, demanding relief from their endless toil. This divine labor strike forced the great gods to find another solution, and that solution was the creation of humanity. Working together, Enki and the mother goddess created human beings from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain god, beings who would take over the labor once performed by the Igigi. This story has profound implications. It suggests that humanity was created specifically to serve the gods, to be their workers and worshippers, and the blood of a divine being in the mixture gave humans something of the divine nature, a spark of godhood that made them more than mere animals but less than gods. Now, some scholars see remarkable parallels between the Igigi rebellion story and the later tradition of the Watchers. Both involve a group of lesser divine beings who rebel against the established order. Both result in massive consequences for humanity. The differences are significant. In the Mesopotamian version, the rebellion leads to human creation, while in the Enochic tradition, the rebellion involves angels who corrupt humanity, but the thematic connections are undeniable. There's another group of Mesopotamian beings we need to discuss before moving to the later traditions, the Apkallu or Seven Sages. In Sumerian they were called the Abgal, and they represent one of the most direct links between Mesopotamian mythology and the Watcher tradition. The Apkallu were legendary figures of extraordinary wisdom who existed in the time before the Great Flood. According to Mesopotamian belief, the Apkallu were created by Enki in the cosmic deep called the Abzu. They were sent to teach humanity the arts of civilization, everything from writing and divination to medicine and craftsmanship. Always 7 in number, they served as advisors to the antediluvian kings, the monarchs who ruled before the flood that nearly destroyed humanity. The tradition names specific Apkallu figures. The first and most famous was Oanna, also known as Oannes in Greek sources. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing around 300 BCE for a Greek audience, described Oannes as a being with the body of a fish, but a human head beneath the fish head and human feet emerging below. This strange hybrid creature would emerge from the sea during the day to teach humanity, then return to the waters at night. The Apkallu taught writing, laws, temple construction, and all the sciences. They were culture heroes in the most fundamental sense, bringing civilization itself to primitive humanity. But here's where things get interesting. In some later Mesopotamian texts, the Apkallu weren't entirely benevolent. They had strong ties to demonology and were occasionally counted as dangerous or malicious beings capable of witchcraft. This duality, beings who bring knowledge but also corruption, will become very important when we discuss the Watchers. Scholar Amar Annas has argued persuasively that the Jewish tradition of the Watchers represents a deliberate inversion of the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition. Where the Mesopotamian sages were generally positive culture heroes, the Jewish tradition recasts similar figures as fallen angels whose forbidden teachings corrupted humanity. The Seven Sages legend spread far beyond Mesopotamia. Scholars have speculated that it influenced the Greek tradition of the Seven Sages of antiquity, though the Greeks removed the supernatural elements. The story of Enoch, seventh from Adam, who ascended to heaven, has been proposed as a variant influenced by the seventh Apkallu, Utuabzu, who was also said to have ascended to heaven. Even more intriguingly, some researchers have found potential Apkallu imagery at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, one of the oldest monumental sites on Earth, dating to around 9000 BCE, thousands of years before the earliest known Mesopotamian texts. If these connections are valid, they suggest that the tradition of wise beings who taught humanity forbidden knowledge extends back to the very dawn of civilization, or perhaps even earlier. So we have the Anunnaki, the great gods who ruled the cosmos and decreed human fate. We have the Igigi, the lesser gods who rebelled against their masters and were replaced by humanity. And we have the Apkallu, the seven sages who brought civilization to mankind, but may have also brought corruption. All of these traditions fed into what would eventually become the story of the Watchers. The cultural transmission of these ideas happened through various channels. Trade routes connected Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean world, carrying goods, but also ideas and stories. Political events, particularly the Babylonian exile of the Jews in the 6th century BCE, brought Jewish intellectuals into direct contact with Mesopotamian culture and literature. Scribal schools preserved and transmitted traditions across generations, sometimes transforming them in the process. The Jews who experienced the Babylonian exile encountered a sophisticated civilization with elaborate religious traditions. They would have been exposed to Mesopotamian mythology through public rituals, through conversations with their captors, and perhaps through access to library collections. Some scholars believe that Jewish scribes may have worked alongside Babylonian scribes, learning cuneiform and gaining access to texts they then adapted for their own purposes. This cultural contact explains many similarities between Mesopotamian and biblical traditions. The flood narrative is the most obvious example, but the influences run deeper. Ideas about divine assemblies, about the structure of the cosmos, about the relationship between gods and humanity. All of these show Mesopotamian influence on Jewish thought. The Watcher tradition represents one particularly creative adaptation of this inherited material. Now let's turn to those later traditions and examine how they transformed these Mesopotamian ideas into something new. The Anunnaki, the divine assembly. Before we can understand the Watchers, we need to take a closer look at the Anunnaki themselves, because these beings form the template from which later traditions would draw. The Anunnaki were not a single homogeneous group with clearly defined membership. Different texts at different times included different gods in this category, but certain names appear consistently across the tradition, and understanding these individual deities helps us understand the powers and functions that would later be attributed to the Watchers. At the top of the hierarchy sat Hanuranu, the sky god and father of the gods. His name literally means heaven in Sumerian. He was considered the oldest and most exalted of the deities, though he often seems remote and uninvolved in human affairs in the myths. One text describes him as so holy that not even the other gods could look upon him. He held ultimate authority but delegated most actual governance to his children and subordinates. Below him came Enlil, whose name probably means Lord of the Air or Lord Wind, though scholars debate the exact translation. Enlil was the effective king of the gods, the one who made decisions and issued decrees. He possessed the tablets of destiny, sacred objects that gave him power over fate itself. When Enlil made a decision, it could not be questioned or changed. Enlil's role in mythology is complex. He's responsible for separating heaven from earth, making the world habitable for life. He's the patron of the city of Nippur, whose temple Echo was called the Mountain House and was considered one of the holiest sites in Mesopotamia. But Enlil also has a darker side. In the flood myths, it's Enlil who becomes so annoyed with humanity's noise that he decides to wipe them out entirely. The flood story appears in multiple Mesopotamian versions. In the Atrahasis epic, humanity has multiplied and become too numerous and too loud, disturbing Enlil's rest. He sends plagues and droughts to reduce their numbers, but each time the god Enki finds a way to help humanity survive. Finally, Enlil convinces the divine assembly to send a catastrophic flood that will destroy all life. Enki, however, warns a righteous man named Atrahasis, who builds a boat and survives with his family and animals. When Enlil discovers that humanity has survived, he's furious, but eventually accepts the situation. The parallels to the biblical Noah story are obvious and well documented, though scholars debate which tradition influenced which. Enki himself, the third member of the Supreme Triad, plays a crucial role in nearly every Mesopotamian myth about human origins. His name means Lord of the Earth in Sumerian, though he's primarily associated with fresh underground waters, wisdom, magic, and crafts. His temple in Eridu was called the Iabzu, the House of the Deep. He's consistently portrayed as humanity's friend and protector, using his cunning to save humans from the wrath of other gods. In the creation myths, it's Enki who devises the plan to create humanity and who provides the wisdom and skill to execute that plan. In the flood myths, it's Enki who warns the survivor. In other texts, he sends the Apkallu sages to teach humanity civilization. Time and again, Enki serves as the intermediary between the divine and human worlds, the god who cares about mortal welfare. Beyond these three, other major deities counted among the Anunnaki include Ninhursag, the mother goddess associated with fertility and the earth. She's sometimes called Enki's consort, and in some creation myths she helps form humanity from clay. The moon god Nana, also called Sin, was considered a son of Enlil and father of the sun god Utu, called Shamash in Akkadian. Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and the planet Venus, was one of the most popular deities, whose myths include her famous descent to the underworld. The god list called an equals Ainum, compiled in ancient times, attempts to organize all the deities systematically. It names hundreds of gods, organized by their relationships and functions. Many of these are minor figures, local deities, or personifications of natural phenomena, but collectively they give us a sense of just how vast the Mesopotamian divine assembly was. One of the most significant functions of the Anunnaki was to decree the fates of gods and humans. In Sumerian mythology, fate wasn't simply predetermined destiny, but rather a divine decision that had to be made and could potentially be changed by the gods, at least before it was enacted. The Anunnaki would gather in divine assembly to make these decisions, with Enlil holding ultimate authority to decree what would happen. This function of determining fate will reappear in the later Watcher traditions, where we see the concept of beings who reveal or influence human destiny, though usually in a negative way. The Watchers don't determine fate so much as interfere with it, teaching secrets that were meant to remain hidden and disrupting the natural order of things. Another important aspect of the Anunnaki is their role as judges. In the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, there are 7 Anunnaki who serve as judges of the dead. When Inanna enters the underworld and is killed by her sister Ereshkigal, she's brought before these 7 judges who condemn her. This group of 7 divine judges will echo through later traditions, including the 7 sages and potentially the leaders of the Watchers, the Anunnaki, were depicted as physically enormous and tremendously powerful, but essentially anthropomorphic, meaning they had human form. Mesopotamian art shows them wearing distinctive horned crowns that indicated divine status. This regalia would be passed down through generations of artistic representation, with later cultures inheriting the imagery of divine beings wearing horned helmets or crowns. Now, the Anunnaki weren't worshipped as a collective group. Rather, each major deity had their own cult, their own temples, their own priesthoods. You wouldn't go to a temple of the Anunnaki, you would go to a temple of Enki or Enlil or Inanna. But the concept of a divine assembly, a gathering of gods who made decisions affecting the cosmos and humanity, was fundamental to Mesopotamian religious thought. When we turn to the later traditions about the Watchers, we find this assembly model preserved. The 200 angels who descend in the Book of Enoch are portrayed as a group with a hierarchical structure, leaders who command groups of subordinates, individuals with specific names and functions. This organization mirrors the Mesopotamian divine assembly, filtered through later religious developments. The relationship between the Mesopotamian traditions and the later Hebrew and Christian concepts is complex and multifaceted. The Israelites spent time in Mesopotamia on multiple occasions, most notably during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. During this period, educated Jews would have had access to Mesopotamian texts and traditions. Some scholars believe that the creation and flood accounts in Genesis were influenced by or responding to Mesopotamian versions of similar stories. Whether this influence was direct borrowing, independent parallel development, or a complex mixture of both remains debated. What's clear is that ideas about divine assemblies, about beings who taught humanity, about catastrophic floods sent by divine wrath, and about the relationship between gods and humans passed from culture to culture across the ancient Near East. The Anunnaki themselves have experienced a strange rebirth in modern popular culture, thanks largely to the writings of Zecharia Sitchin. Beginning with his book The 12th Planet in 1976, Sitchin claimed that the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, who visited Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago. According to his theory, they genetically engineered humans from early hominids to serve as workers for mining gold. Mainstream scholars have universally rejected Sitchin's translations and interpretations, pointing out numerous errors in his understanding of Sumerian language and deliberate misrepresentation of texts. But his ideas have proven remarkably persistent in popular culture, influencing everything from television documentaries to major motion pictures. The ancient astronaut theory, as it's often called, treats the Mesopotamian texts as literal historical accounts of alien contact. For our purposes tonight, what matters is what the ancient texts actually say, not modern reinterpretations. And what they say is that the Sumerians and their Mesopotamian successors believed in a vast assembly of divine beings who created humanity, decreed fate, and intervened regularly in human affairs. These beings had names, personalities, specific powers, and often complicated relationships with one another. Now let's turn to one of the most important developments in this tradition, the emergence of the Watcher concept in Jewish thought, and examine the individual names and powers attributed to these fascinating figures, the Igigi, the forgotten gods who rebelled. Before we leave Mesopotamia entirely, we need to spend more time with the Igigi, because their story represents perhaps the closest ancient parallel to the later Watcher rebellion. The Igigi were, in many texts, the younger gods who served the Anunnaki, the cosmic laborers who maintained creation before humanity existed. The most detailed account of the Igigi comes from the Atrahasis epic, one of the most important Mesopotamian texts for understanding both creation mythology and the flood tradition. The text survives in multiple copies from different periods, allowing scholars to trace how the story evolved over time. The earliest known version dates to the reign of King Amisaduqa of Babylon around 1646 to 1626 BCE. According to this epic, in the beginning there were two classes of gods. The great Anunnaki were the rulers, the decision-makers, the ones who held authority. The Igigi were their servants, forced to perform all the hard physical labor required to maintain the cosmos. The text describes their suffering in vivid terms, comparing their work to that of laborers digging canals and carrying baskets of earth. When the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil, the text reads, the toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much. For 40 years the Igigi labored. They dug the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They maintained the waterways. They did everything the Anunnaki demanded. But eventually they reached their breaking point. The Igigi gathered together and made a fateful decision. They burned their tools, their baskets, their spades, everything they used for their labor. Then they marched to the dwelling of Enlil, the king of the gods, and surrounded it by night. They demanded relief from their endless toil. This was, in essence, the first labor strike in recorded literature. When Enlil discovered the rebellion, he was furious. He demanded to know who had organized this uprising, wanting to punish the ringleaders. But the rebels presented a united front, refusing to single out any individual for blame. They insisted that their grievances were legitimate, that the work was simply too much for them to bear forever. Faced with this unprecedented situation, the Divine Assembly had to find a solution. The gods couldn't simply destroy the Igigi because they needed workers. They couldn't force the Igigi back to labor because the rebellion had shown that this wasn't sustainable. Something new had to be created. It was Enki, as usual, who provided the answer. He proposed creating a new class of beings who would take over the work of the Igigi. Working together with the mother goddess, known in this text as Mami or Nintu, Enki devised the plan for creating humanity. They would mix clay with the blood of a slain god, creating beings who had something of the divine nature but were mortal and subordinate to the gods. One of the Igigi, a god named Geshtui, meaning ear, or perhaps wisdom, was chosen for sacrifice. His blood was mixed with clay, and from this mixture the first humans were formed. This detail is profound. It means that according to Mesopotamian belief, humanity carries within it the essence of a divine being, specifically a rebellious divine being. We were created from the blood of a god who participated in a cosmic revolt. Some scholars have seen this as an explanation for human nature, a divine spark coming from a source tainted by rebellion. The Igigi, freed from their labor, returned to the heavens. In some later texts, the term Igigi becomes associated specifically with the sky gods, while Anunnaki refers to gods of the underworld. The terminology shifts and blurs over time, making it difficult to track exactly how the Mesopotamian tradition understood these groups. But the story of their rebellion remains consistent, a tale of cosmic workers who refused their assigned role and thereby changed the structure of the universe. Now let's consider the parallels with the later Watcher tradition. In the Book of Enoch, 200 angels rebel against the divine order. They're not rebelling against labor as such, but against the prohibition on interacting with humans in certain ways. Their sin is different. They take human wives and teach forbidden knowledge rather than refusing to work, but the structure of the story is remarkably similar. Both traditions involve a group of lesser divine beings who transgress against the established order. Both involve a collective decision made by the group, often with identifiable leaders. Both result in cosmic consequences that affect humanity. And both traditions name specific individuals within the rebellious group, allowing us to examine their particular roles and fates. The Igigi rebellion in Atrahasis has a relatively positive outcome, the creation of humanity to carry the burden of work. The Watcher rebellion in Enoch has catastrophically negative outcomes, the corruption of humanity, the birth of monstrous giants, and eventually the great flood sent to cleanse the earth. But in both cases, the rebellion is the catalyst for major changes in the relationship between divine and human realms. Some scholars have gone further in drawing connections between the Igigi and the Watchers. The term Watcher itself comes from the Aramaic word Ea, meaning waking one or vigilant one. It suggests beings who are always awake, always watching. In the Mesopotamian tradition, we find similar ideas about divine beings who observe and record human actions, who never sleep, who maintain constant vigilance over creation. The Igigi, in some texts, were associated with specific celestial bodies, particularly the planets. They were sky gods in the most literal sense, beings whose dwelling place was the heavens above. When they descended to earth in the rebellion story, they left their proper place in the cosmos. This vertical movement, the descent from heaven to earth, becomes a central feature of the Watcher tradition. It's important not to overstate these connections. The Igigi rebellion and the Watcher rebellion are different stories with different theological messages. The Mesopotamian tradition doesn't involve sexual interaction between gods and humans in this context, while that's central to the Enochic Watcher story. The Mesopotamian tradition doesn't emphasize forbidden knowledge in the same way, and the ultimate fates of the rebellious beings differ significantly. But the existence of these parallels suggests that ideas about divine rebellion were present in the cultural environment from which the Watcher tradition eventually emerged. When Jewish authors in the Second Temple period developed their elaborate mythology about fallen angels, they weren't inventing from scratch. They were drawing on, transforming, and sometimes deliberately inverting older traditions about the relationship between gods and humanity. One more Mesopotamian concept deserves mention before we move on. In some texts, we hear of beings who are bound or imprisoned, cast down from the heights to dwell in darkness. The Babylonian creation epic describes the defeat and binding of Tiamat's monstrous servants. Other texts speak of gods or demons confined to the underworld. This imagery of binding and imprisonment will become central to the Watcher tradition, where the fallen angels are chained in darkness until the day of judgment. The Greek myth of the Titans also parallels these traditions in interesting ways. The Titans were ancient gods who ruled before the Olympians, were defeated in a great war, and were imprisoned in Tartarus beneath the earth. The term Tartarus appears in the New Testament book of 2 Peter specifically in reference to the punishment of sinning angels, showing how Greek and Hebrew concepts merged in later thought. So as we prepare to examine the Watcher tradition proper, we should understand that it emerged from a rich cultural context, where ideas about divine rebellion, fallen beings, imprisoned gods, and the origins of evil had been circulating for millennia. The Jewish authors who developed the Watcher mythology were participating in a long conversation about these themes, even as they transformed the material into something distinctively their own. The Apkallu, 7 sages of forbidden knowledge. We've touched on the Apkallu already, but they deserve deeper exploration because they represent perhaps the most direct link between Mesopotamian mythology and the Watcher tradition. These 7 sages were culture heroes par excellence, beings who brought the arts of civilization to humanity in the time before the Great Flood. The Apkallu tradition is preserved in multiple sources. Ritual texts describe them and their functions. Mythological compositions mention their activities. Royal inscriptions invoke their authority, and the Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek around 300 BCE, provided detailed accounts of their appearances and teachings that would influence later Western thought about these figures. According to the tradition, the Apkallu were created by Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. They emerged from the Abazu, the cosmic underground ocean that Enki ruled. Their purpose was to serve as teachers of humanity, bringing all the knowledge necessary for civilized life. They appeared in the time of the earliest kings before the flood destroyed the antediluvian world. The most famous of the Apkallu was the first, known as Ioanna in Sumerian and Akkadian sources, or Oannes in the Greek account of Berossus. Berossus described Oannes in remarkable detail. He was a creature whose whole body was that of a fish, but beneath the fish's head was another head, that of a man. Human feet grew from the fish's tail. His voice was human. An image of him was preserved even in Berossus's time. Every day, according to Berossus, Oannes would come out of the sea and spend the day among humans, teaching them letters, sciences, arts, city building, temple founding, lawmaking, and the principles of geometry. He taught them how to harvest crops and gather fruits, basically everything that makes civilized life possible. But he never ate any food during his time with humans, and at sunset he would return to the sea, spending the night beneath the waves. This image of a being who comes from the waters to teach humanity, who possesses supernatural knowledge and the patience to share it with primitive people, who maintains a connection to a watery realm beyond human reach, has fascinated scholars and mystics for centuries. Some have seen in Oan a memory of culture contact with a more advanced civilization. Others have proposed extraterrestrial visitation. More soberly, we can see the Apkallu as mythological figures embodying the mysterious origins of civilization itself. The names of all 7 Apkallu are preserved in various texts, though the exact list varies somewhat between sources. The Bit Messeri ritual text, used for protecting houses against evil, gives one standard list: Wana, Wanaduga, Enmaduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu. Each sage was associated with a particular antediluvian king, serving as that monarch's divine advisor. What did the Apkallu teach? The sources are expansive but not always consistent. They taught writing, which the Mesopotamians considered a divine gift of enormous importance. They taught divination, the art of reading signs to determine divine will and future events. They taught astronomy and the tracking of celestial bodies. They taught medicine and healing. They taught temple building and proper religious ritual. They taught the crafts of civilization, everything from metalworking to agriculture. One particularly significant text is the Catalogue of Texts and Authors, which attributes the authorship of various important works to specific Apkallu. The sage Adapa, closely associated with or identified with Uana, is credited with important celestial omen texts. This attribution elevated scribes to the status of inheritors of divine wisdom, continuing the work that the antediluvian sages began. But here's where things get complicated. Not all Mesopotamian texts portray the Apkallu in purely positive terms. Some later traditions associated them with demons, with witchcraft, with dangerous and potentially malevolent knowledge. The Apkallu could protect against evil spirits, yes, but they were also connected to demonic realms. This ambiguity is crucial for understanding how the later Watcher tradition might have developed. Scholar Amar Anus has argued extensively that the Jewish Watcher tradition represents a deliberate inversion of the Apkallu mythology. Where the Mesopotamians generally celebrated the sages who brought civilization, the Jewish tradition recasts similar figures as fallen angels whose teachings corrupted humanity. The same basic story, wise beings descending to teach forbidden knowledge, receives radically different moral evaluation. Consider the parallels. The Apkallu were 7 in number. The Watchers have specific leaders, with traditions sometimes emphasizing groups of 7 or 21. The Apkallu taught astronomy, medicine, and crafts. The Watchers teach astrology, root cutting, and metallurgy. The Apkallu existed before the flood. The Watchers' activities lead directly to the flood. The Apkallu were fish-like beings who came from water. Some Watcher traditions associate the fallen angels with monstrous or hybrid forms. The differences are also significant. The Apkallu don't interbreed with humans, the Watchers do, producing the monstrous Nephilim. The Apkallu teachings are generally positive from the Mesopotamian perspective. The Watcher teachings are explicitly sinful and corrupting. The Apkallu serve the divine order, the Watchers rebel against it. One particularly intriguing connection involves the 7th sage Utuabzu, who according to some traditions ascended to heaven. This detail parallels the biblical figure of Enoch, who was 7th from Adam, and who walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. Both figures occupy the 7th position in their respective genealogies, and both are associated with ascension to the divine realm, rather than normal death. The Enochic literature expands enormously on the brief biblical mention of Enoch. In the Book of Enoch, Enoch becomes the primary revealer of heavenly secrets, the one who witnesses the punishment of the Watchers and intercedes on their behalf. He's the human counterpart to the fallen angels, a mortal who receives divine knowledge legitimately, in contrast to the Watchers who steal or illicitly share forbidden wisdom. The Apkallu imagery persisted long after the decline of Mesopotamian civilization. Their fish-cloaked forms appear on Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs, where they perform protective rituals. Small figurines of Apkallu were buried beneath building foundations to ward off evil. Their distinctive iconography spread throughout the ancient and Near East and beyond. When we turn now to the Book of Enoch and examine the individual Watchers, we should keep the Apkallu in mind. The tradition of wise beings who taught humanity before the flood was ancient and widespread. The Jewish authors who developed the Watcher mythology were working with familiar materials, transforming them to serve their own theological purposes. The Apkallu represent knowledge as gift, civilization as divine blessing mediated through semi-divine teachers. The Watchers represent knowledge as temptation, forbidden wisdom that corrupts rather than elevates. Both traditions grapple with the same fundamental question: where does human knowledge come from, and what are the spiritual implications of that origin? The Book of Enoch and the Watchers. Now we turn to the primary source for the Watcher tradition, the Book of Enoch, also known as First Enoch or the Ethiopic Enoch. This remarkable text preserves the most detailed account of the Watchers, their names, their powers, their crimes, and their punishment. Though not included in most biblical canons, it profoundly influenced Jewish and Christian thought about angels, demons, and the origin of evil. The Book of Enoch as we have it today is actually a collection of separate works that were combined over time. Scholars identify 5 major sections with different authors and dates. The Book of the Watchers, which contains most of the Watcher material we'll be discussing, is found in chapters 1 through 36. This section was probably composed in the 4th or 3rd century BCE, making it one of the earliest portions of the text. The Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran have revolutionized our understanding of this text. These fragments, dating from around 200 to 150 BCE, prove that the Watcher tradition was already ancient and well established by the time of Jesus. The community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls clearly valued the Enochic literature highly. The complete Book of Enoch survives only in Ethiopic, translated from Greek versions that were themselves translated from the original Aramaic. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church accepts First Enoch as canonical scripture, making it one of the few places in the world where this ancient text is read as sacred writ. The text also influenced the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, and ultimately the New Testament itself, where Jude directly quotes from Enoch. So what does the Book of Enoch tell us about the Watchers? The story begins in chapter 6, where we learn that the children of heaven looked upon the beautiful daughters of men and desired them. These children of heaven are the Watchers, angels who were supposed to observe humanity from above, but instead became entranced by human beauty. Their leader was Semyaza, a name we'll examine in detail shortly. Semyaza expressed concern to his fellow Watchers, fearing that he alone would bear responsibility for the great sin they were contemplating. But the others reassured him, proposing that they all swear an oath together, binding themselves by mutual curses not to abandon the plan. This oath is crucial. It makes the transgression collective and deliberate, not accidental or individual. Then they all swore together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it, the text reads. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. The text even explains the mountain's name, claiming it derives from the Hebrew word for curse or ban, because that's where the angels took their oath. Mount Hermon itself is a real place, the highest peak in the anti-Lebanon mountain range, straddling the modern border between Syria and Lebanon. Its snow-capped summit would have been visible from much of ancient Israel, a constant reminder of the heavenly realms above. In later Jewish tradition, The mountain retained its association with divine and demonic powers, and some scholars suggest it may be the site of Jesus' transfiguration, as described in the New Testament. The text then lists the names of the 20 leaders, or chiefs of tens, among the 200 Watchers. Each of these leaders commanded a group of 10, giving us a clear hierarchical structure. These names are presented as ancient and powerful, the true names of the beings who corrupted humanity before the flood. After naming the leaders, the Book of Enoch describes the crimes of the Watchers. They took human wives and had children with them. They taught humanity all sorts of forbidden knowledge, and their offspring, the giants or Nephilim, grew to enormous size and began devouring everything they could find, eventually turning to cannibalism and bloodshed. The cry of humanity rose to heaven, and the 4 great archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, looked down from the heights and saw what was happening. They brought their concerns before God, the Most High, describing the devastation that Azazel and the other Watchers had caused. God's response was swift and comprehensive. The Watchers would be bound and imprisoned, their offspring destroyed, and the earth cleansed by a great flood. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel, casting him into a pit in the desert called Dudael, covering him with rough and jagged rocks where he would remain until the day of judgment. Gabriel was sent to cause the giants to fight among themselves, destroying each other in battle. Michael was sent to bind Semyaza and his associates in the valleys of the earth for 70 generations, until the final judgment when they would be cast into fire. Noah was warned of the coming flood and instructed to preserve humanity. The earth would be cleansed of the corruption caused by the Watchers, and a new age would begin. But the Watchers themselves, bound in darkness, would wait through the ages for their ultimate punishment. This narrative raises profound theological questions that engaged ancient thinkers and continue to fascinate modern readers. Where does evil come from? The Book of Enoch provides an answer. Evil entered the world through angelic rebellion, through divine beings who abandoned their proper place and corrupted humanity with forbidden knowledge. This explanation differs from the Genesis account of the serpent in the garden, offering an alternative etiology for human sinfulness. The Book of Enoch also addresses the problem of giants in the ancient world. Ancient people found enormous bones, likely dinosaur fossils, and wondered what creatures had produced them. The Nephilim tradition provided an explanation. These were the remains of the giant offspring of angels and humans destroyed in the Great Flood. The text continues beyond the initial Watcher narrative, describing Enoch's journeys through the cosmos where he witnesses the places of punishment prepared for the fallen angels. He sees the fiery abyss where they will be tormented. He intercedes on their behalf, but God refuses to forgive them. The Watchers' sin was too great, their corruption too fundamental, for any remedy but eternal punishment. This cosmological framework became enormously influential. The idea of a vast spiritual realm with multiple heavens, populated by both faithful and rebellious angels, with specific places of reward and punishment, would shape both Jewish and Christian apocalyptic thought. When we read about the chain of darkness in 2 Peter, or the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels in Matthew, we're hearing echoes of the Enochic Watcher tradition. The Book of Enoch thus provides our primary source for the names and powers of the Watchers. But it wasn't the only ancient text to address these beings. The Book of Giants, fragments of which were found at Qumran, tells the story from the perspective of the Nephilim themselves, including their terrifying dreams and their attempt to contact Enoch for interpretation. The Book of Jubilees provides another version of the Watcher story with some different details, and later traditions in Rabbinic Judaism, Christianity and Islam all engaged with and transformed the Watcher mythology. Now let's examine the individual Watchers, beginning with their leader, Semyaza. Semyaza, the leader of the rebellion. Among all the Watchers, Semyaza stands out as the primary leader, the one who organized the rebellion and led his fellows in their descent to Mount Hermon. His name appears in various spellings across different manuscripts and translations: Semjaza, Shemyaza, Shemihaza, Shemhazai, and several other variants all refer to the same figure. The name is Semitic in origin, and scholars have debated its exact meaning. The most widely accepted interpretation connects the name to the Hebrew words meaning "my name is seen," or "he sees the name." The name in question would refer to God, suggesting that this angel was originally positioned to perceive the divine, to watch God constantly. This interpretation carries profound irony. Semyaza, whose name meant he was always watching God, turned his gaze instead toward the daughters of men. He who was supposed to be fixed on the divine became entranced by the mortal. His very name becomes an indictment of his crime. Another proposed interpretation translates the name as gazer at the heavens, or gazer from the heavens. This fits the watcher concept perfectly. These were beings whose function was to watch, to observe, to maintain vigilance. Semyaza was perhaps chief among these watchers, the one whose gaze was supposed to be most keen, most constant, most focused on his divine duties. In the Book of Enoch, Semyaza is portrayed as initially hesitant about the plan to descend and take human wives. He expresses fear that he alone will bear the penalty for this great sin, suggesting that his followers might abandon him when consequences arrive. But the other watchers reassure him, proposing the mutual oath that will bind them all together in their transgression. This detail is psychologically interesting. Semyaza knows the plan is sinful, knows it will result in punishment, knows the risk he's taking. Yet he proceeds anyway, securing only the commitment of his followers before moving forward. He's not deceived about the nature of his actions. He sins with full knowledge and deliberate intent. The Book of Enoch credits Semyaza with specific teachings. According to chapter 8, verse 3, Semyaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. In the ancient world, this would refer to magical practices, specifically the use of plants for spells, potions, and medicines. The cutting of roots was associated with both healing arts and darker magic, the manipulation of natural forces for supernatural ends. This particular teaching connects Semyaza to traditions about forbidden knowledge of nature. The natural world contained secrets, hidden powers in plants and minerals that could be accessed through proper knowledge. By teaching root cutting, Semyaza revealed how to manipulate these forces, giving humanity power over nature that they weren't meant to possess. The punishment of Semyaza is described in 1 Enoch chapter 10. God commands the archangel Michael to bind Semyaza and his associates who have defiled themselves with women. They are to be bound in the valleys of the earth for 70 generations, until the day of judgment when they will be cast into eternal fire. Their beloved offspring will be destroyed, and they will witness that destruction before their own imprisonment. This is a crucial detail. Semyaza and the other bound watchers must watch, ironically, as their children destroy each other and are themselves destroyed. The beings whose sin was abandoning their watching function are condemned to watch the consequences of their actions forever. Their punishment involves the very faculty they perverted. The concept of 70 generations of imprisonment connects to Jewish chronological systems and suggests an extremely long period of time. Some interpreters calculated this literally, placing the final judgment of the Watchers at a specific future date. Others understood the number symbolically, indicating an age-long imprisonment that would end only at the ultimate eschatological moment. In later Jewish traditions, Semyaza appears under various names with additional legends attached. The Midrash of Shemazai and Azael tells an expanded story where Semyaza develops a relationship with a mortal woman named Istahar. When he reveals the secret divine name to her, attempting to seduce her with his knowledge, she uses that name to ascend to heaven and is placed among the stars. Semyaza, left alone, hangs upside down between heaven and earth as punishment. This later legend develops themes only hinted at in the original Enochic material. The divine name, the ineffable word of power, becomes a plot element. The human woman proves more righteous than the angel, using his forbidden knowledge to escape rather than succumb. And Semyaza's punishment becomes even more visually dramatic, suspended eternally between the realms he tried to bridge illicitly. Some traditions identify Semyaza with the constellation Orion, suggesting that his bound form is visible in the night sky. Others associate him with specific geographical features where he was supposedly imprisoned. These later developments show how the Watcher mythology continued to grow and adapt, attaching itself to observable phenomena and creating a sense of the story's continued relevance. Semyaza's name sometimes appears alongside Azazel as co-leader of the Watchers, with different texts giving prominence to one or the other. Some scholars have suggested that these represent originally separate traditions that were later combined. Semyaza leads the Watchers who take wives. Azazel is primarily associated with teaching forbidden knowledge. Together they represent the two main crimes of the fallen angels: illicit sexuality and illicit revelation. The figure of Semyaza influenced later demonology, though he never achieved the prominence of Satan or some other fallen angels in the Christian tradition. He appears in medieval grimoires and magical texts, usually as a powerful being who can be summoned or invoked. His original context as leader of the Watchers sometimes survives in these later materials, other times is completely transformed. Understanding Semyaza helps us understand the Watcher tradition as a whole. He represents the willful choice to rebel, the full knowledge of consequences coupled with the decision to proceed anyway. He organized and led the transgression, and his punishment, bound and watching through the ages perfectly, mirrors his crime of abandoning his watching function for forbidden desires. The psychological portrait of Semyaza that emerges from the ancient texts is remarkably sophisticated. He's not a simple villain or a mindless corrupter. He's a being who experiences desire, fear, calculation, and ultimately commitment to a course of action he knows is wrong. This makes him a far more interesting figure than a mere demon of wickedness. His initial hesitation is particularly telling. Semyaza knew that what he was planning was sinful. He knew there would be consequences. He feared being blamed alone if his co-conspirators abandoned him. This shows a being capable of moral reasoning, capable of foreseeing outcomes, capable of weighing costs and benefits. His sin was not ignorance, but willful transgression. The oath that bound the Watchers together reflects ancient Near Eastern treaty practices. Such oaths were taken with deadly seriousness in the ancient world, invoking divine witnesses and carrying severe penalties for violation. By binding themselves together, the Watchers ensured that none could escape or retreat. They were all in this together, for better or worse. The location of the oath-taking, Mount Hermon, became significant in subsequent tradition. This mountain at the northern edge of the land of Israel was associated with divine and demonic powers for centuries. Later legends located various supernatural events there, including possibly the transfiguration of Jesus in Christian tradition. The mountain became a symbol of the intersection between heavenly and earthly realms, appropriate for the site where angels descended to earth. The name Hermon itself came to be etymologically connected to the Hebrew word for curse or ban, though this connection may have been invented to fit the mythology, rather than reflecting the mountain's original name. Either way, the association stuck. Hermon was the place where the angels cursed, themselves by their oath, the place where heaven's rebellion touched earth. Semyaza's specific teaching, the cutting of roots and enchantments, connects him to traditions about natural magic. In the ancient world, plants were believed to contain hidden powers that could be activated through proper knowledge and technique. Root cutting wasn't simply botany, it was accessing the secret forces embedded in creation. By teaching this art, Semyaza revealed mysteries that were meant to remain hidden. The sexual dimension of Semyaza's transgression shouldn't be overlooked. The Watcher's primary crime was taking human wives, and Semyaza led this transgression. The mixing of angelic and human through sexual union represented a fundamental violation of the created order. Semyaza's desire for beautiful human women drove the entire rebellion, making lust a cosmic force that corrupted not just individuals but the entire world. This connection between sexual desire and cosmic corruption influenced later religious thought profoundly. The association of sexuality with sin, the fear of desire as a spiritual danger, the linking of bodily pleasure with demonic influence. All of these themes can be traced in part to the Watcher tradition and Semyaza's leading role in it. Azazel, the teacher of forbidden arts. If Semyaza represents the organizational leader of the Watcher rebellion, Azazel represents its most notorious teacher. His name has become perhaps the most famous of all the Watcher names, appearing in biblical texts, later demonology, and countless works of popular culture. Understanding Azazel helps us understand what the ancient authors considered most dangerous about the forbidden knowledge the Watchers shared. The name Azazel presents interpretive challenges. It appears in the Hebrew Bible in Leviticus chapter 16 in connection with the Day of Atonement ritual. 2 goats were selected, one for the Lord and one for Azazel. The goat for Azazel was sent into the wilderness bearing the sins of the people, giving us the term scapegoat. But what exactly Azazel meant in this context has been debated for millennia. Some interpreters understood Azazel as a place name, referring to a rocky cliff or desert location. Others saw it as a description meaning the goat that departs, or complete removal. But by the Second Temple period, many Jews understood Azazel as the name of a demonic being, a fallen angel to whom the sin-bearing goat was sent. The Book of Enoch fully develops this interpretation. In the Enochic tradition, Azazel is one of the most powerful and culpable of the Watchers. Chapter 8 verse 1 describes his teachings. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all colouring tinctures. This is a comprehensive catalogue of forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught metallurgy, the working of metals into weapons and ornaments. He taught cosmetics, the use of antimony for eye makeup and various dyes for colouring. He taught jewellery making, the crafting of precious stones into adornments. In modern terms, we might say he taught metallurgy, cosmetology, and lapidary arts. Why would these teachings be considered sinful? The text provides the answer. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways. The weapons enabled violence and warfare. The cosmetics enabled vanity and seduction. The precious ornaments enabled greed and display. Each teaching, however neutral in itself, led to moral corruption. This represents a sophisticated critique of technology and civilization. The same skills that enable human achievement also enable human sinfulness. Metalworking produces both plowshares and swords, tools for agriculture and tools for murder. Cosmetics can enhance beauty or facilitate deception. The Book of Enoch suggests that humanity wasn't ready for these technologies, that receiving them prematurely from angelic sources corrupted rather than elevated us. The connection between Azazel and weaponry has particular significance. In the ancient world, the ability to make metal weapons transformed warfare. Bronze and eventually iron weapons gave their wielders enormous advantages over those still using stone tools. The Book of Enoch presents this technological leap as a spiritual tragedy, enabling violence on a scale previously impossible. Some scholars have seen in Azazel a transformed version of the Greek Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Both figures bring forbidden knowledge, both are punished severely for their transgression, and both stories address the ambiguous nature of technological progress. The parallels may indicate cultural contact between Greek and Jewish traditions, or independent development of similar themes. Azazel's punishment is described in detail. the archangel Raphael is commanded to bind him hand and foot and cast him into darkness. A pit in the desert is opened, the place called Dudael, and Azazel is thrown in. Rough and jagged rocks are placed upon him, and he is covered with darkness, unable to see light. There he must remain until the day of judgment, when he will be cast into fire. The name Dudael may connect to the wilderness location mentioned in Leviticus, where the scapegoat was sent. Some interpreters see the two traditions as related, with the desert wilderness being the place where demonic forces dwell and where sins are symbolically sent away from human habitation. Azazel's imprisonment thus gives mythological weight to an already existing ritual practice. The text explicitly states that all sin is to be ascribed to Azazel. The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. This is a remarkable claim, making Azazel ultimately responsible for all human wickedness. His teaching set in motion a chain of corruption that spread through all subsequent generations. This theological move has significant implications. If Azazel is responsible for all sin, then humanity is partially exculpated. We didn't invent our own wickedness. It was taught to us by a fallen angel. This represents one answer to the perennial question of evil's origin, placing blame on supernatural beings rather than inherent human nature. In later Jewish tradition, Azazel's role in the Day of Atonement ritual was further developed. Some texts describe him as the leader of a class of demons, the Seirim or hairy ones, goat demons who inhabited the desert. The connection between Azazel and goats, established in Leviticus, continued through centuries of interpretation. Christian tradition generally absorbed Azazel into the broader category of fallen angels or demons, sometimes identifying him with Satan or treating him as a lieutenant of the devil. Medieval demonology classified and organized various demonic beings, and Azazel appeared in these systems with varying roles and attributes. The grimoire tradition invoked his name in magical operations, though practitioners disagreed about his exact nature and powers. Islamic tradition knows Azazel under a related form. The story of Harut and Marut in the Quran describes two angels who descended to earth and taught magic to humans. Some Islamic commentators connected this tradition to the earlier Enochic material, though with significant modifications. In one version, Azazel was among the angels who might have descended but repented and was allowed to return to heaven, while Harut and Marut continued their transgression. The figure of Azazel thus travelled through multiple religious traditions, adapting and transforming while maintaining core associations with forbidden knowledge, wilderness exile, and ultimate punishment. His name became synonymous with certain forms of occult practice and demonic association, far beyond the original Enochic context. Understanding Azazel helps us understand the Watcher tradition's complex relationship with human civilization. The arts that Azazel taught weren't inherently evil. Metalworking and jewelry making are morally neutral technologies. But in the mythological framework of the Book of Enoch, their premature revelation corrupted humanity, enabling sins that might otherwise have been impossible or at least less widespread. This reflects an ambivalence about progress that runs through much ancient religious literature. Civilization has costs as well as benefits. Technologies enable new forms of evil, even as they enable new forms of good. The Watcher tradition personifies this ambivalence in the figure of Azazel, the bearer of forbidden, arts whose gift became humanity's curse. The specific technologies Azazel taught reveal the concerns of the ancient authors. Weapons enabled large-scale violence, transforming petty conflicts into devastating wars. The text associates Azazel's metallurgical teaching directly with increased bloodshed on Earth. Bronze and iron weapons made killing easier and more efficient, and Azazel bore responsibility for introducing this deadly knowledge. Cosmetics might seem like a minor concern compared to weapons, but the ancient authors saw them as equally dangerous in their own way. Adornment and beautification enabled vanity and seduction. Women could enhance their appearance to attract men, potentially leading to sexual immorality. The connection between cosmetics and fornication appears explicitly in the text, linking Azazel's teaching to moral corruption. Jewelry and precious stones represented wealth and status, enabling greed and social inequality. The ability to craft beautiful objects from rare materials created new forms of desire and competition. Azazel thus taught not just technical skills but the foundations of materialistic culture, with all its attendant problems. The comprehensive nature of Azazel's teaching suggests that the authors saw him as a kind of anti-culture hero. Where figures like the Apkallu brought civilization as a gift, Azazel brought civilization as a curse. The same technologies that made human life more comfortable also made it more corrupt. Progress and moral decline went hand in hand. This pessimistic view of civilization contrasts sharply with Mesopotamian traditions that celebrated the Apkallu's teachings. The Jewish authors were deliberately inverting the positive valuation of technological progress found in their cultural environment. They saw what Mesopotamian culture celebrated and said, "No, actually that was bad. That was the source of our problems, not our salvation." The ascription of all sin to Azazel is remarkable in its comprehensiveness. The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. This makes Azazel not just one source of evil among many, but the primary source, the ultimate origin of human wickedness. Without his teachings, the implication is, humans might have remained innocent. This raises interesting questions about human moral agency. If Azazel is responsible for all sin, are humans merely victims of his corruption, or do humans bear their own responsibility for how they use the knowledge he provided? The text doesn't fully resolve this tension, allowing both interpretations to coexist. The punishment of Azazel, covered with rocks in the desert of Dudael, carries particular symbolic weight. He who taught humans to work metal and create beautiful things is condemned to lie beneath ugly, jagged rocks in a barren wilderness. He who revealed the secrets of the earth is buried within it. He who enabled human adornment is stripped of all beauty and comfort. The blindfolding aspect of Azazel's punishment is also significant. He's covered so that he may not see light. This sensory deprivation intensifies his suffering, but also symbolically reverses his role as one who revealed hidden things. He who brought knowledge to light is condemned to eternal darkness. He who opened human eyes to forbidden arts has his own eyes covered forever. The connection between Azazel and the Day of Atonement scapegoat ritual adds layers of meaning. The goat sent into the wilderness for Azazel carried the sins of the people away from the community. In the Anunnaki mythology, Azazel is the ultimate bearer of sin, the one upon whom all transgression is placed. The ritual practice and the mythology reinforce each other, creating a comprehensive theology of sin and atonement. The other named Watchers and their powers beyond Semyaza and Azazel. The Book of Enoch names numerous other Watchers, each associated with specific teachings and powers. These names preserve an ancient angelology, a systematic naming and categorization of supernatural beings. Let's examine these figures and what they allegedly taught humanity. The list in 1 Enoch chapter 6 gives the names of 20 leaders, the chiefs of tens who commanded groups of subordinates among the 200. Different manuscripts preserve slightly different lists, and the exact number and identity of named Watchers varies between sources. But certain names appear consistently and deserve individual attention. Arakiel, also spelled Arakiel, Arakael, or Saraquel in various texts, taught humans the signs of the earth, what we might call geomancy or divination through earthly phenomena. This would include reading signs and natural events, predicting the future through observation of the physical world. The ability to interpret earth signs gave power to those who possessed it, allowing them to make decisions based on supposedly supernatural knowledge. Amaros, sometimes Amaros or Armonial, taught the resolving of enchantments. This suggests counter-magic, the ability to break spells or nullify magical workings. In a world where magic was considered real and dangerous, the ability to resolve enchantments would be highly valuable, defensive magic against the offensive spells of others. Barakiel, whose name might mean lightning of God, taught astrology, the reading of celestial signs and the influence of stars on human affairs. Astrology was one of the most sophisticated sciences of the ancient world, requiring detailed astronomical observation and complex interpretive systems. The Mesopotamians developed elaborate astrological traditions that influenced all subsequent Western astrology. Kokabel, or Kokabiel, taught the constellations specifically. This relates to but differs from general astrology, focusing on the stellar patterns and their meanings. Knowledge of constellations was essential for navigation, agriculture, and religious calendrics in the ancient world. By teaching this knowledge, Kokabel gave humans practical power over their relationship to the heavens. Ezekiel, sometimes Ezekiel in some lists though, not the biblical prophet, taught the knowledge of the clouds. This might mean weather prediction, the ability to read cloud formations and anticipate storms, or it might refer to cloud divination, reading signs and omens in cloud patterns. Either way, it represents knowledge about atmospheric phenomena and their meanings. Shamziel, whose name connects to the Hebrew word for sun, taught the signs of the sun. This would include solar observation, understanding of the solar cycle, and perhaps solar divination. The sun's movements were fundamental to ancient timekeeping and religious calendrics. Knowledge of solar signs gave power over the measurement and organization of time. Sariel, also called Suriel, taught about the courses of the moon. Lunar cycles were crucial for ancient calendars, particularly Jewish religious observance. The moon's phases affected planting, harvesting, and ritual timing. Knowledge of lunar courses was both practical and spiritual, connecting earthly activities to celestial rhythms. Gadriel or Gadriel has particular significance because some traditions credit him with leading Eve astray in the Garden of Eden. He's also associated with teaching the art of cosmetics and the use of weapons. This links him to Azazel's portfolio, suggesting overlap or perhaps variant traditions that were later distinguished. Penemu, whose name might mean the inside, taught the art of writing with ink and paper. This is remarkable because writing was considered one of humanity's greatest achievements, often attributed to divine or semi-divine origins. By crediting a watcher with teaching writing, the text takes a suspicious view of this technology, grouping it with other forbidden knowledge. He taught the children of men the bitter and the sweet, and the secrets of wisdom, the text says of Penemu. This comprehensive phrase suggests that Penemu's teaching encompassed both specific skills, like writing, and broader philosophical or practical wisdom. The secrets of wisdom implies esoteric knowledge, hidden truths that weren't meant for human consumption. Yekon or Jikon is described as the one who misled all the children of the angels, leading them down to earth and corrupting them through the daughters of men. This makes him a kind of tempter even among the Watchers, the one who initiated the desire that led to their fall. He represents the origin of the corruption that spread through the angelic ranks. Asbil is credited with giving evil counsel to the other Watchers, particularly regarding the plot to defile themselves with humans. He's thus a co-conspirator in the original plan, one of those who helped transform desire into action. His name might mean deserter of God, or something similar, indicating his fundamental unfaithfulness. Kassadia taught specific harmful knowledge, including the flagellations of all evil and terrible things like causing miscarriages. This represents the darker end of the Watcher teachings, knowledge specifically designed for harm rather than neutral technologies that could be misused. Kassadia's portfolio is explicitly malicious. These various teachings cover an enormous range of human knowledge. Astronomy and astrology, weather observation and prediction, writing and wisdom, magic and counter-magic, warfare and cosmetics, good knowledge and explicitly harmful knowledge. All of it came from the Watchers according to the Enochic tradition. The overall picture is of a vast transfer of power from the supernatural to the human realm, a transfer that corrupted both. The relationship between these teachings and actual historical developments is complex. Ancient humans did develop writing, metallurgy, astronomy, and cosmetics. They did learn to predict weather and track celestial movements. The Book of Enoch provides a mythological explanation for these real achievements, attributing them to angelic instruction rather than human invention. Some scholars see in this a kind of historical memory, perhaps of cultural contact with more advanced civilizations, or technological leaps that seemed almost supernatural to those who experienced them. Others see it as a theological commentary on the double-edged nature of human progress. Still others read it as pure mythology, stories that explain the present by narrating a mythical past. What's clear is that the Watcher tradition took a comprehensive view of forbidden knowledge. It wasn't just one or two specific technologies that the angels revealed, it was the entire toolkit of civilization. Everything that makes human life more than mere animal existence, writing and working metal, tracking stars and reading, signs, all of it came tainted by its supernatural origin. The punishment of these various watchers follows the same pattern established for Semyaza and Azazel. They are bound and imprisoned until the day of judgment, when they will face final destruction in fire. Their offspring are destroyed, the earth is cleansed by the flood, and a new human race begins under different conditions. But the knowledge the Watchers taught couldn't be destroyed so easily. According to the Book of Jubilees, the astrological teachings of the Watchers survived the flood, carved into rock where they were found by later generations. The corruption they introduced continued to affect humanity, even after the flood had washed away the original sinners. This explains, in the mythological framework, why post-flood humanity still struggles with the same issues that plagued the antediluvian world. The Nephilim, offspring of the Watchers. The crimes of the Watchers were twofold. They taught forbidden knowledge and they produced forbidden offspring. These offspring, the Nephilim, became a major element of the Watcher tradition and connect to broader ancient Near Eastern traditions about giants in the primordial world. The term Nephilim appears in the Hebrew Bible itself, in Genesis chapter 6 and Numbers chapter 13. The Genesis passage describes them as the offspring of the sons of God, and the daughters of men, the mighty men of old, men of renown. The Numbers passage describes the inhabitants of Canaan as giants descended from the Nephilim, so large that the Israelite spies felt like grasshoppers in comparison. The exact meaning of the word Nephilim has been debated for centuries. The most common interpretation connects it to the Hebrew root meaning to fall, making them the fallen ones. This fits the Enochic tradition, where they are the offspring of fallen angels. Other interpretations suggest those who cause others to fall, or simply giants, based on how the term was used. The Book of Enoch elaborates enormously on the brief biblical references. The Nephilim grew to enormous size, consuming first the crops and livestock of humanity, then human beings themselves. They drank blood and committed violence on a massive scale. Their very existence corrupted the earth, filling it with the kind of wickedness that prompted God to send the flood. And they became pregnant, and they bore great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, the text reads. An ell is a measurement roughly equivalent to a cubit, or about 18 inches, meaning these giants would be thousands of feet tall, clearly an exaggeration meant to emphasize their monstrous nature. They consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. The image is horrifying. Creatures of supernatural origin, impossibly large, who eat everything available and then turn to cannibalism when other food runs out. They represent the ultimate corruption of the natural order. Beings who shouldn't exist consuming beings who should. Their presence makes the earth uninhabitable for normal humans. The Book of Giants, fragments of which were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, tells the story from the perspective of these Nephilim. The text names specific giants, including Ohia and Haya, and remarkably includes Gilgamesh, the famous hero of Mesopotamian legend. This connection between the Nephilim tradition and the Gilgamesh epic shows how Jewish authors were engaging with and transforming broader Near Eastern mythology. In the Book of Giants, the Nephilim receive disturbing dreams that foretell their destruction. One giant named Maui travels to find Enoch, seeking interpretation of these visions. The dream imagery includes a great flood washing away everything except 3 names on a tablet, clearly symbolic of Noah and his sons who will survive the coming destruction. Enoch provides interpretation through tablets he sends to the giants. He confirms that they and their fathers are doomed, that the dreams indeed foretell cosmic judgment. The giants' response varies. Some repent, others rage, some fall into despair, but ultimately none can escape the fate decreed against them. The destruction of the Nephilim happens in 2 stages according to the Enochic tradition. First, they turn on each other in devastating civil war. The Archangel Gabriel is specifically sent to cause this conflict, to destroy the children of the Watchers from amongst men, send them one against the other that they may destroy each other in battle. The giants who survive this internecine warfare are then destroyed in the Great Flood. But even death doesn't end the Nephilim problem. The Book of Enoch teaches that when the giants died, their spirits became demons that continue to afflict humanity. Evil spirits shall proceed from their flesh, because they were created from above. From the Holy Watchers was their beginning and primary foundation, the text explains. These spirits shall be called evil spirits upon earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. This represents a significant theological development. The Book of Enoch provides an origin story for demons, explaining where these malevolent spiritual beings came from. They're not simply evil angels or abstract forces of wickedness. They're the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, still roaming the earth and causing harm even after their physical bodies were destroyed in the flood. This demonology influenced subsequent Jewish and Christian thought. The idea that demons were specifically the spirits of the destroyed Nephilim provided a systematic explanation for supernatural evil. It connected earthly demonic activity to the primordial events narrated in the Watcher tradition, making demonology an extension of angelology and flood mythology. The Nephilim traditions connect to broader ancient Near Eastern beliefs about giants in the primordial world. The Greek Titans, the Norse Jotuns, and similar figures in other mythologies all represent a class of beings who existed before the current order of the world, who were defeated or destroyed by the gods who now rule, but whose influence persists in various ways. The biblical tradition preserves references to various giant peoples, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, and others. These are sometimes connected to the Nephilim, sometimes treated as distinct groups. The confusion in the sources reflects the complexity of ancient beliefs about primordial giants and their relationship to human-sized peoples. Goliath, the Philistine champion killed by David, is described as being of enormous stature. Some traditions connect him to the Rephaim or to Nephilim descendants who somehow survived the flood. His story shows how the giant tradition continued to influence Israelite thought long after the flood mythology was established. The Book of Jubilees provides additional details about the Nephilim and their destruction. According to this text, 10% of the demons were allowed to remain active on earth even after the flood, under the authority of a demonic leader named Mastema. This explains the continued existence of evil spirits despite the supposed cleansing of the earth. The Nephilim thus represent the physical consequences of the Watcher rebellion. Where the Watchers themselves corrupted humanity through forbidden teaching, the Nephilim corrupted the earth through their very existence. Together, the 2 aspects of Watcher transgression, illicit knowledge and illicit reproduction, created a world so thoroughly corrupted that only complete destruction through the flood could address the problem. This comprehensive view of pre-flood corruption served theological purposes for the ancient authors. It explained the severity of the flood judgment. God wasn't simply angry at human misbehavior, but was addressing a cosmic crisis that threatened the very fabric of creation. The Nephilim's existence represented a fundamental violation of the boundaries between kinds of beings, a mixing of heaven and earth that had to be unmixed. The traditions about the Nephilim continued to develop after the Enochic literature. Rabbinic Judaism generally downplayed the Watcher interpretation, preferring to understand the sons of God in Genesis as human descendants of Seth rather than angels. But the Nephilim as giants persisted in Jewish tradition, appearing in various forms through centuries of interpretation. Christian tradition inherited both the angelic interpretation and the skepticism about it. Some church fathers accepted the Enochic Watcher tradition, others rejected it, preferring Augustine's human interpretation. The debate continued through the medieval period and into modern times, with different Christian communities taking different positions on the nature and origin of the Nephilim. Today, the Nephilim have experienced a revival in popular culture. They appear in novels, films, video games, and television series, usually portrayed as powerful supernatural beings, sometimes villains and sometimes anti-heroes. This modern interest often has little connection to the ancient sources, creating new mythologies loosely based on the old names and concepts. The physical characteristics attributed to the Nephilim in various ancient sources paint a picture of beings utterly unlike ordinary humans. Their size was the most obvious difference, but they were also described as possessing supernatural strength, sometimes having unusual physical features like extra fingers or toes, and exhibiting appetites that went far beyond normal human needs. Some texts describe them as having glowing eyes or unusual skin, marks of their mixed heritage. The weapons and warfare of the Nephilim reflected both their supernatural power and the forbidden knowledge their fathers had shared. They wielded metal weapons crafted with techniques taught by Azazel, making them far more deadly than any human warriors of that era could have been. Their violence wasn't random but systematic, organized destruction that threatened to exterminate humanity entirely. Some scholars have suggested that the Nephilim traditions preserve memories of genuine, historical conflicts, perhaps between different human populations with significantly different technologies or physical characteristics. The arrival of Bronze Age peoples among Stone Age populations, for instance, might have seemed like an invasion of giants with magical weapons. Whether or not such historical cores exist, the mythological elaboration transformed these beings into something cosmic and supernatural. The relationship between the Nephilim and their Watcher fathers is portrayed with remarkable psychological complexity in the Book of Giants. The giants love their fathers but are also trapped by their fathers' sins. They seek to understand their fate and even to change it, but they cannot escape the cosmic judgment decreed against them. There's genuine tragedy in their situation, beings who didn't choose to be born, who didn't choose their nature, yet who must suffer the consequences of their parents' transgressions. This theological problem, the punishment of children for parents' sins, was significant in ancient Jewish thought. The Book of Enoch and related texts don't resolve this tension entirely, but they do suggest that the Nephilim were not merely innocent victims. Their monstrous nature led them to commit monstrous acts, making them guilty in their own right even beyond the inherited guilt of their origins. The legacy of the Nephilim extended far beyond the flood that destroyed their physical bodies. As demons, their spirits continued to influence human affairs, tempting people to sin, causing illness and misfortune, and generally perpetuating the corruption their fathers had introduced. This demonological framework explained why the world remained wicked even after the flood supposedly cleansed it. The ritual practices of various ancient and medieval traditions often addressed the problem of demons believed to be Nephilim spirits. Exorcism, protective amulets, binding spells, all of these responded to the threat of malevolent spirits that had plagued humanity since the antediluvian age. The practical religion of ordinary people thus connected to the cosmic mythology of the Watcher tradition. Understanding the Nephilim also helps us understand ancient attitudes toward hybridity and boundary crossing. The mixing of categories, divine with human, heaven with earth, was profoundly threatening to ancient cosmological thinking. The created order depended on things staying in their proper places. When angels left heaven and humans left their purely mortal state, the result was chaos and corruption. This concern with boundaries appears throughout ancient religion. Dietary laws that prohibited mixing certain foods, textile regulations that prohibited mixing certain fibers, agricultural rules that prohibited mixing certain seeds, all reflect a similar concern with maintaining proper distinctions. The Nephilim represented the ultimate boundary violation, and their destruction represented the ultimate restoration of proper order. But understanding the original Watcher tradition, including the Nephilim, helps us understand how ancient people thought about the relationship between divine and human realms. The boundaries between these realms were supposed to be maintained. When angels crossed those boundaries, taking human wives and producing hybrid offspring, they created an existential threat to both worlds. The Nephilim embodied that threat, and their destruction was necessary to restore proper order to creation. Connections between traditions. As we near the end of our exploration tonight, let's step back and consider the broader connections we've traced. We began with the Sumerians, whose clay tablets preserved the earliest written records of divine beings who interacted with humanity. The Anunnaki, the Igigi, the Apkallu, all these figure into the cultural background from which the Watcher tradition eventually emerged. The journey from Sumer to Second Temple Judaism spans thousands of years and crosses multiple cultural boundaries. Yet the threads of connection are unmistakable. Ideas about divine assemblies, about the structure of the cosmos, about beings who descend to teach humanity, all of these traveled from Mesopotamia into Jewish tradition, transformed along the way but recognizably related. The Igigi rebellion in particular shows how ancient Mesopotamian thought grappled with the idea of lesser divine beings who transgressed against the established order. Though the specific details differ significantly from the Enochic Watcher tradition, the structural similarity is striking. Both involve a group of subordinate supernatural beings who rebel. Both result in major changes for humanity, and both are preserved in texts that influence subsequent religious thought. The theological differences between the traditions are as instructive as the similarities. In the Mesopotamian version, the Igigi rebellion was essentially a labor dispute that led to human creation. The gods needed workers, the Igigi refused, so humanity was created to fill the gap. There's no strong moral condemnation of the Igigi for their rebellion. If anything, their complaint is portrayed sympathetically. The Watcher tradition inverts this evaluation entirely. The angels' descent isn't a response to unfair labor conditions. It's a transgression driven by lust and pride. Their teachings don't create civilization, they corrupt it. Their offspring aren't a solution to a problem, they are the problem. The same basic narrative structure receives radically different moral interpretation. This inversion suggests that the Jewish authors were consciously engaging with Mesopotamian mythology, deliberately transforming it to serve their own purposes. They knew the stories about wise beings who descended to teach humanity. They chose to reframe those stories as accounts of fallen angels whose teachings corrupted rather than civilized. The polemic intent is clear. The Apkallu tradition provides perhaps the closest parallel to the Watcher concept. Both involve beings who descend from the divine realm to teach humanity. Both are associated with the antediluvian period before a catastrophic flood. Both represent a transfer of knowledge from supernatural to human realms. The crucial difference is evaluation. The Mesopotamian tradition generally celebrates the Apkallu as culture heroes, while the Jewish tradition condemns the Watchers as corrupting rebels. Understanding this deliberate inversion helps us appreciate what the ancient Jewish authors were doing. They weren't simply recording traditions they'd inherited. They were engaging critically with the dominant culture around them. They were saying, "You think those beings who brought civilization were heroes? We know differently. They were rebels against God whose gifts were actually curses." This kind of cultural polemic appears throughout the Hebrew Bible and related literature. the Jewish tradition frequently took elements from surrounding cultures and transformed them to serve its own theological purposes. The Watcher tradition is one particularly elaborate example of this process, creating something new from inherited materials. This inversion is theologically significant. It suggests that the Jewish authors who developed the Watcher tradition were consciously engaging with Mesopotamian mythology, transforming it to serve their own religious purposes, the same basic story, wise beings descending to teach. Humanity receives radically different moral interpretation depending on the religious context. The Jewish appropriation and transformation of Mesopotamian material wasn't unusual in the ancient world. Cultural exchange across the Near East meant that ideas, stories, and religious concepts flowed between civilizations. The Jewish authors during and after the Babylonian exile would have had access to Mesopotamian traditions and texts. Their response was often to adopt and adapt, taking elements from surrounding cultures and reshaping them to fit Jewish theology. The Book of Enoch represents one particularly elaborate example of this cultural adaptation. It takes themes familiar from Mesopotamian religion, the divine assembly, the antediluvian sages, the Great Flood, and weaves them into a distinctive Jewish narrative about angelic rebellion, forbidden knowledge, and divine judgment. The result is something new, neither purely Mesopotamian nor purely biblical, but a creative synthesis that influenced both Judaism and Christianity for centuries. The names of the Watchers themselves may preserve ancient Semitic religious terminology transformed for new purposes. Names like Semyaza and Azazel have plausible Hebrew or Aramaic etymologies, but they may also connect to older divine names from the broader Semitic world. By the time they appear in the Enochic literature, they've been integrated into a specifically Jewish theological framework. The influence of the Watcher tradition extended far beyond its origins. Early Christians read the Book of Enoch and took it seriously. Jude quotes from it directly, and its influence can be detected throughout the New Testament. The letter of 2 Peter refers to angels who sinned and are kept in chains until judgment, clearly drawing on Enochic traditions. The elaborate angelology and demonology of medieval Christianity owes significant debts to the Watcher mythology. Islamic tradition also engaged with these themes, though often in transformed ways. The Quran's references to Iblis and the Jinn, to Harut and Marut, to the fallen angels who taught magic, all connect in various ways to the broader tradition of supernatural beings who transgressed against the divine order. The specifics differ significantly from the Enochic material, but the thematic connections are unmistakable. Modern scholarship has greatly expanded our understanding of these connections. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed that the Enochic literature was ancient and authoritative for at least some Jewish communities. The ongoing decipherment of Mesopotamian texts continues to reveal new parallels and connections. The academic study of comparative religion and mythology allows us to trace how ideas flowed between cultures across the ancient world. These scholarly advances have made the Watcher tradition more accessible than ever before. Translations are available in multiple languages. Commentaries explain the difficult passages. Academic studies situate the texts within their historical and cultural contexts. Anyone interested in these ancient traditions can now explore them in depth, building their own understanding of these mysterious figures and the traditions that preserve their memory. Yet the mystery at the heart of these traditions remains. Where does human knowledge come from? Is it purely human invention, or does it have supernatural origins? Is technological progress inherently good, or does it carry spiritual dangers? Are there boundaries between realms of existence that should not be crossed? The Watcher tradition addresses all these questions, and its answers, whether we accept them literally or read them symbolically, continue to provoke thought. The enduring fascination with the Watcher tradition speaks to something deep in human nature. We remain curious about our origins, about the sources of our knowledge and our failings. We still wonder whether there are limits we shouldn't transgress. whether some knowledge is better left unknown. The ancient authors who first told these stories were grappling with the same questions that occupy us today. The narrative of angelic descent, forbidden teaching, and cosmic judgment provides a framework for thinking about these issues. Whether one accepts it as literal history, as symbolic mythology, or as imaginative literature, it offers a perspective on the human condition that differs from purely secular accounts. The Watcher tradition suggests that our situation is cosmic, that our choices matter in ways that extend beyond the merely human. This cosmic perspective may explain why the tradition has persisted while so much else from the ancient world has been forgotten. It speaks to permanent features of human experience, our ambivalence about progress, our sense that something is wrong with the world, our hope for ultimate justice. The Watchers embody these concerns in concrete, narrative form, making the abstract tangible and the cosmic personal. The punishment and binding of the Watchers. The fate of the Watchers stands as one of the most vivid examples of divine judgment in all of ancient literature. These beings who abandoned their stations in heaven, who took wives among human women, who taught forbidden secrets, they didn't simply face death or disappearance. They faced something far worse: eternal imprisonment, conscious suffering, the agony of watching their beloved offspring destroyed, and the certainty of final annihilation at the end of all things. The Book of Enoch describes multiple stages and forms of punishment for the rebellious angels. The first stage involves binding. The archangels, specifically Raphael, Michael and Gabriel, receive commands from God to restrain the Watchers. Raphael binds Azazel in the desert wilderness. Michael binds Semyaza and his associates in the valleys of the earth. Gabriel causes the giants to turn against one another in self-destructive warfare. The imagery of binding is significant. These were beings of enormous power, capable of descending from heaven, of interbreeding with humans, of teaching advanced knowledge. Yet they can be bound by other angels, demonstrating that there exists a hierarchy of power even among celestial beings. The Watchers, for all their might, are subordinate to the archangels who remain faithful to God. The location of Azazel's imprisonment, Dudael, is described as a place in the desert where rough and jagged rocks cover him. He's placed in darkness, his face covered so he cannot see light. This sensory deprivation adds to the punishment, removing all comfort, all beauty, all connection to the heavenly realms he abandoned. Azazel, who taught humanity to beautify themselves, is condemned to ugliness and darkness forever. The phrase rough and jagged rocks deserves attention. It's not a comfortable prison, but a painful one. The rocks press upon Azazel, causing physical suffering. Some interpreters have connected this imagery to the scapegoat ritual in Leviticus, where the goat for Azazel was sent into the wilderness and, according to later tradition, pushed off a cliff to its death on the rocks below. Semyaza and the other Watchers face a different but equally terrible fate. They're bound in the valleys of the earth, places of depth and darkness for 70 generations. This specific time frame connects to Jewish chronological calculations and suggests an unimaginably long period of imprisonment. Generation after generation passes while the Watchers remain bound, conscious, suffering, waiting. The text emphasizes that the Watchers must witness the destruction of their children. This is not merely punishment but retribution specifically designed to match their crime. They desired human women and produced offspring. Now they must watch those offspring destroy each other and die. The punishment mirrors the sin, creating a kind of cosmic justice that the ancient authors found satisfying. First, Enoch chapter 14 describes Enoch's attempt to intercede for the Watchers. He's approached by the imprisoned angels who beg him to present a petition to God on their behalf. Enoch writes their petition and their prayers and reads it aloud. Then he has a dream vision in which he's brought into the divine presence to receive God's response. The response is emphatic rejection. God tells Enoch that the Watchers should have interceded for humans, not the other way around. Their petition is denied. They will receive no forgiveness. They abandoned their heavenly station for earthly pleasures, and now they will never return to heaven. Their prison is eternal, or at least will last until the final judgment, when something even worse awaits them. The final judgment is described in apocalyptic terms. On the day of the great judgment, the Watchers will be cast into fire. The abyss of fire waits for them, a place of eternal torment that makes their current imprisonment seem mild by comparison. Their current suffering is merely a prelude to the ultimate punishment that God has prepared. This two-stage punishment, imprisonment now and fiery destruction later, influenced Christian concepts of hell and judgment. The idea that demons and fallen angels exist in a state of punishment but await something worse at the final judgment appears throughout the New Testament. The chains of darkness in 2 Peter, the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels in Matthew, these draw directly or indirectly on the Enochic punishment traditions. The geography of punishment in the Book of Enoch is elaborate. Enoch tours the cosmos and sees the various places prepared for different categories of beings. He sees where righteous souls wait for resurrection, where wicked souls await judgment, where fallen angels abound, where the final fires burn. This spiritual geography would influence both Jewish and Christian conceptualizations of the afterlife for centuries. One particularly vivid passage describes Enoch seeing 7 stars of heaven bound together in a chaotic, horrible place. These stars are identified as angels who transgressed God's command, apparently a separate group from the Watchers, or perhaps an alternative description of the same beings. Their punishment involves binding for 10,000 years, after which they will be cast into fire. The numerical precision in these texts, 70 generations, 10,000 years, specific quantities, reflects ancient Jewish interest in calculating divine timetables. Apocalyptic writers love to specify periods, to give readers a sense that everything was proceeding according to plan, that God's judgment might be delayed but was absolutely certain. The Watcher's punishment unfolds according to a divine schedule that cannot be altered. The binding of the Watchers also has cosmic implications. Their transgression disrupted the proper order of the universe, mixing realms that should have remained separate. Their binding restores that order, or at least contains the damage they caused. The cosmos can function properly again, even though the Watchers remain in existence somewhere beneath the earth. Some texts suggest that the bound Watchers still exercise influence over human affairs, that their imprisonment is not total isolation from the world they corrupted. The demons that plague humanity, the spirits that tempt people to sin, these may be connected to the Watchers either as their disembodied offspring or as spiritual emissions from the imprisoned angels themselves. Evil continues because its source, though bound, still exists. This provides a mythological explanation for the persistence of evil after the flood. If the flood was supposed to cleanse the earth, why does evil still exist? Because the ultimate sources of evil, the Watchers, and their demonic offspring weren't destroyed, only imprisoned. The cleaning was partial, temporary, a holding action, until the final judgment when God will deal with evil comprehensively and permanently. The punishment traditions also reflect on the nature of angelic free will. The Watchers chose to rebel. They weren't compelled or deceived. They made a conscious decision to abandon their stations and pursue forbidden desires. This means they bear full moral responsibility for their actions, which in turn justifies their severe punishment. They knew what they were doing was wrong, and they did it anyway. This raises theological questions about the nature of angels that would occupy thinkers for centuries. If angels have free will, why did some choose to rebel? Is rebellion somehow intrinsic to the nature of freedom, such that even heavenly beings in the presence of God can choose wickedness? The Watcher tradition doesn't answer these questions directly, but it raises them in ways that would generate extensive theological reflection. The legacy of the Watcher tradition. The influence of the Watcher tradition extends far beyond the Book of Enoch and related texts. This mythology about fallen angels, forbidden knowledge, and cosmic judgment shaped religious thought for millennia and continues to resonate in contemporary culture. Let's trace some of the ways this ancient tradition left its mark on human thought. In Second Temple Judaism, the period from roughly 515 BCE to 70 CE, the Anunnaki literature was widely read and highly respected. Multiple Jewish communities seem to have accepted these texts as authoritative, alongside or just below the books that would eventually become the Hebrew Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran preserved numerous copies of Anunnaki texts, suggesting they considered them extremely important. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, refers to the tradition of angels who fell through lust for women, indicating that this was widely known even outside the communities that preserved the written texts. The Book of Jubilees, another Second Temple text that became canonical for Ethiopian Christians, incorporates and develops the Watcher tradition, showing how the mythology continued to evolve. Early Christianity inherited the Watcher tradition through multiple channels. The New Testament letter of Jude directly quotes from 1st Enoch, treating it as authoritative prophecy. 2 Peter refers to angels who sinned and were cast into Tartarus. The Gospels and Epistles reflect the demonology developed in the Enochic tradition, understanding demons as evil spirits that afflict and possess human beings. Several church fathers of the first few centuries CE accepted the Book of Enoch as scripture, or at least as valuable religious literature. Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Clement of Alexandria all show familiarity with an acceptance of the Watcher tradition. They used it to explain the origin of demons, the nature of angelic rebellion, and the prehistory of human sinfulness. However, a significant shift occurred in the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential Christian theologians, rejected the angelic interpretation of Genesis chapter 6. He preferred to understand the sons of God as descendants of Seth, who intermarried with descendants of Cain. This interpretation avoided some of the theological difficulties raised by angels having physical bodies and producing offspring. Augustine's interpretation became dominant in Western Christianity for centuries. The Book of Enos fell out of use in most Christian communities, eventually being lost entirely in the West until modern times. Only the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the complete text, which they continue to regard as canonical scripture today. Yet even as the text itself disappeared, elements of the Watcher tradition persisted in transformed forms. Medieval Christian demonology incorporated the idea of fallen angels who tempt and torment humanity. The elaborate hierarchies of demons, the naming and classifying of evil spirits, all drew on traditions that ultimately trace back to the Enochic mythology. The rediscovery of 1st Enoch by European scholars in the 18th century sparked renewed interest in the Watcher tradition. James Bruce brought Ethiopian manuscripts to Europe in 1773, and translations soon made the text available to Western readers. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century further confirmed the antiquity and importance of the Enochic literature. Modern scholarship has extensively analyzed the Watcher tradition, its origins, its development, its influence. Scholars like R.H. Charles, George Nicholsberg, and Ephraim Isaac have produced detailed translations and commentaries that make this material accessible to contemporary readers. The academic study of Second Temple Judaism has placed the Enochic literature at the center of understanding that fascinating period. Popular culture has also embraced the Watchers and Nephilim. Novels, films, television series, and video games feature these figures, usually with significant departures from the original sources. The ancient astronaut theory, popularized by Erich von Daniken and Zechariah Sitchin, reinterprets the Watchers as extraterrestrial visitors, an interpretation that mainstream scholars reject, but that has proven remarkably persistent in popular imagination. The Watcher tradition has also influenced esoteric and occult movements. Various magical and mystical systems incorporate the names and powers of the Watchers into their practices. The grimoire tradition of medieval and early modern Europe invoked these beings in magical operations. Contemporary occultism continues to engage with Enochic material, creating new interpretations and practices. Religious movements outside the mainstream have also found the Watcher tradition compelling. Various new religious movements have built theologies around the fallen angels and their influence on human history. Some interpret the Watchers literally as beings who corrupted human genetics, requiring specific spiritual interventions to address. Others read them symbolically, but still find profound meaning in the mythology. The Watchers raise questions that remain relevant. Where does human knowledge come from? Is technological progress inherently good, or does it carry spiritual dangers? Are there boundaries that shouldn't be crossed? What is the origin of evil? These questions drove the ancient authors who developed the Watcher tradition, and they continue to drive contemporary reflection on the human condition. The persistence of these questions across millennia suggests something fundamental about human nature. We've always wondered about our place in the cosmos, about the sources of our achievements and our failures. The Watcher tradition provided one comprehensive answer. We are partly divine, partly earthly, taught by beings who shouldn't have taught us, carrying knowledge that perhaps we shouldn't possess. This ambivalence about human achievement runs through much religious literature. Progress and corruption often seem inseparable. The same fire that cooks food can burn cities. The same metal that makes plows makes swords. The same writing that preserves wisdom can spread lies. The Watcher tradition gave narrative form to this perceived ambivalence, embedding it in a cosmic story of angelic rebellion and divine judgment. The individual Watchers, with their specific names and specific teachings, personified different aspects of human knowledge and skill. By naming these beings, by identifying who taught what, the ancient authors created a comprehensive mythology of human culture. Every significant human achievement had its angelic teacher, and every angelic teacher paid the price for sharing what should have remained hidden. This naming was not arbitrary. The names carried meaning, connecting the beings to their functions and their fates. Semyaza, who watched the divine name, abandoned his watching for earthly desires. Azazel, the scapegoat, became the one upon whom all sin was placed. Shamsiel, whose name echoes the sun, taught the signs of the sun. The names were theological statements, compact expressions of entire mythological roles. The tradition of naming supernatural beings would continue through Jewish, Christian, and Islamic angelology and demonology. Medieval grimoires would claim to reveal the true names of hundreds of spirits, believing that knowing a name gave power over its bearer. This magical thinking may have had ancient roots in traditions like the Watcher mythology, where names were not mere labels but expressions of essential nature. The Watcher tradition also raises questions about free will and predestination. The Watchers chose to rebel, demonstrating that even heavenly beings have the freedom to choose evil. Yet their punishment suggests that such choices carry inevitable consequences that cannot be avoided. The tension between freedom and fate, between choice and consequence, runs throughout the tradition and influenced later theological reflection on these issues. The four archangels who bound the Watchers, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, became central figures in their own right. They represented divine justice executing divine commands, the enforcement arm of heavenly authority. Their roles in the Watcher narrative established patterns that would continue through subsequent angelology, making them among the most important figures in Jewish and Christian supernatural belief. Each archangel received a specific task in dealing with the Watchers and their consequences. Raphael bound Azazel. Gabriel caused the giants to war against each other. Michael bound Semyaza and his associates. Uriel warned Noah of the coming flood. This division of labor suggested a heavenly bureaucracy, an organized system of divine agents carrying out God's will in the world. The cosmology of the Book of Enoch, with its multiple heavens and specific places of punishment, influenced subsequent Jewish and Christian understanding of the spiritual universe. The idea that there exist distinct locations in the spiritual realm, places prepared for specific purposes, would appear throughout apocalyptic literature and eventually in mainstream religious teaching about heaven, hell, and purgatory. Enoch's tours of these spiritual locations gave readers a sense of the vast scope of creation beyond the visible world. He saw the storehouses of winds and waters. He saw the paths of celestial bodies. He saw the places where righteous souls waited for resurrection and wicked souls waited for judgment. And he saw where the Watchers were bound, suffering in darkness until the end of time. This visionary literature created powerful images that have persisted through centuries of religious imagination. The chains of darkness, the pit of fire, the binding of powerful beings beneath the earth, all of these became standard elements of religious cosmology. Even people who never read the Book of Enoch absorbed its imagery through the cultures it influenced. The relationship between Enoch and the Watchers is particularly interesting. Enoch was a righteous human who received divine knowledge legitimately, through revelation rather than theft. He represents the proper way for humans to gain wisdom, through humble reception of what God chooses to reveal, rather than grasping for what should remain hidden. In this sense, he's the anti-Watcher, the human counterpart who does right what they did wrong. Enoch's intercession on behalf of the Watchers, though ultimately unsuccessful, shows remarkable compassion. These beings had corrupted the world and deserved their punishment, yet Enoch still tried to help them. His failed intercession demonstrates both the limits of mercy and the severity of the Watcher's transgression. Some sins are simply too great for forgiveness. This theological point had implications for how later readers understood divine justice. God's mercy is vast but not unlimited. Some boundaries once crossed cannot be uncrossed. The Watcher's punishment served as a warning to all beings, angelic and human alike, about the consequences of transgressing divine law. Closing thoughts. Tonight, we've travelled through thousands of years of religious and mythological tradition, from the first clay tablets of Sumer to the elaborate angelology of Second Temple Judaism. We've encountered gods and angels, sages and demons, giants and floods, and at the centre of it all we've found the Watchers, those mysterious beings whose names and powers have fascinated generations of readers. The journey has taken us from the temples of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Anunnaki decreed the fates of humanity, through the labour camps where the Agigi rebelled against divine servitude, past the fish-cloaked Apkallu who taught the arts of civilization, and finally to Mount Hermon, where 200 angels swore their fateful oath. Each step of this journey has revealed connections between traditions, threads linking distant cultures across time and space. Semyaza, who led the descent and bound his fellows by oath. Azazel, who taught metallurgy and cosmetics and bears the blame for all sin. Arakiel and Barakiel, Shamsiel and Seriel, and dozens more, each with specific teachings and powers. These names survive in ancient manuscripts, carrying meanings that scholars continue to debate. The naming of these beings reflects the ancient conviction that names carry power. To know a being's true name was to know something essential about its nature. The Watcher names encoded their functions, their crimes, and sometimes their fates. This concern with naming would persist through centuries of angelology and demonology, shaping religious practice as well as religious belief. The Watchers represent something profound about human self-understanding. We've always sensed that our knowledge, our technologies, our civilization itself came from somewhere mysterious. The Watcher tradition gives that intuition a narrative form. Wise beings descended from heaven and taught us everything we know. But the tradition also warns that this knowledge was stolen, forbidden, corrupting. The gift was also a curse. This ambivalent assessment of civilization resonates across cultures and across time. The Greek myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and was eternally punished, expresses a similar anxiety. The biblical story of Eden, where eating from the tree of knowledge brought both wisdom and death, grapples with the same theme. The Watcher tradition joins a chorus of human voices asking whether our achievements are blessings or burdens. The Nephilim, those monstrous offspring of the Watchers, represent the physical consequences of crossing boundaries. They embody the corruption that follows when different orders of being intermingle inappropriately. Their destruction, first through civil war and then through the flood, demonstrates that such corruption cannot be sustained. The created order has limits, and violating them brings catastrophic consequences. The four archangels who appear in the narrative, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael and Uriel, became central figures in Jewish and Christian tradition. Their specific roles in dealing with the Watchers and their offspring established patterns that would be elaborated for centuries. These angels represent divine justice, the enforcement of cosmic order against those who would violate it. Whether you approach these texts as scripture, as mythology, as historical curiosities, or as imaginative literature, they reward careful attention. The ancient authors who composed and transmitted these traditions were grappling with questions that remain relevant. Where does evil come from? What are the spiritual implications of technological progress? Are there things humanity wasn't meant to know? The Watcher tradition offers one set of answers to these perennial questions. The scholarly study of these texts continues to reveal new insights. Archaeological discoveries, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, have transformed our understanding of the Enochic literature. Comparative study of Mesopotamian and Jewish traditions has illuminated the cultural context in which the Watcher mythology developed. The work of understanding these ancient texts is ongoing, and each generation of scholars builds on the work of those who came before. For those who approach these traditions religiously, the Watchers serve as a warning about the dangers of transgressing divine boundaries. They demonstrate that even heavenly beings can fall, that knowledge can corrupt as well as enlighten, that the created order has limits that must be respected. The punishment of the Watchers, bound in darkness until the day of judgment, stands as a permanent reminder of the consequences of rebellion. For those who approach these traditions historically or culturally, the Watchers provide a window into ancient thought about the relationship between human and divine, the origins of civilization, and the problem of evil. They show how ancient peoples made sense of their world, how they explain the presence of suffering and the ambivalence of progress. The mythology may not be literally true, but it preserves truths about human experience. The names of the Watchers echo across millennia. Semyaza, bound in chains of darkness, waiting for judgment. Azazel beneath the rocks of Dudael, source of all sin. The spirits of the Nephilim, wandering the earth as demons. These images still have power to disturb and fascinate. The tradition also preserves a vision of ultimate justice. The Watchers' crimes will not go unpunished. The corruption they introduced will be cleansed. At the end of time, final judgment will set all things right. This eschatological hope, the conviction that divine justice will ultimately prevail, gave comfort to ancient readers facing a world full of suffering and injustice. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the Watcher tradition is its insistence that cosmic events have moral significance. The Watchers didn't fall by accident, they fell by choice. Their punishment wasn't arbitrary, it fit their crimes. The flood wasn't mere natural disaster, it was divine response to corruption. Everything that happens in the cosmic drama has meaning and purpose. This conviction that the universe is morally significant runs through religious traditions around the world. We want to believe that our choices matter, that good will be rewarded and evil punished, that the apparent chaos of existence masks an underlying order. The Watcher tradition articulates this conviction in vivid narrative form, making cosmic justice tangible through the stories of specific beings and their fates. And so I leave you with the mystery intact. What were the Watchers? Were they purely mythological, symbolic figures embodying human anxieties about knowledge and power? Were they transformed memories of older gods from Mesopotamian religion? Were they something else entirely, something that truly descended from the heights and changed the course of human history? The ancient texts preserve the names and the story, but they leave the ultimate interpretation to us. The tradition invites us to wonder, to investigate, to take seriously questions about the nature of knowledge, the origins of evil, and the relationship between human and divine. Whatever answers we ultimately reach, the questions themselves are worth asking. They connect us to the ancient peoples who first recorded these traditions and to the generations of readers who have pondered them since. The study of these traditions also connects us to the broader human heritage of mythological and religious thinking. People across cultures and across time have grappled with similar questions, producing different answers but recognizing the same fundamental mysteries. The Watcher tradition is one thread in a vast fabric of human thought about the cosmos, our place in it, and the powers that shape our destiny. The names we've discussed tonight, Semyaza, Azazel, Arakiel, Barakiel, and all the others, have echoed through millennia. They've been written on clay tablets, on parchment, on vellum, and now they appear on digital screens. The medium changes, but the mystery endures. These beings, whether historical, symbolic, or imaginary, continue to capture human imagination. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Watchers and their true names and powers, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what you think about these ancient traditions and whether you'd like to explore related topics in future videos. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring mysteries, and keep that wonderful spirit of wonder alive. The ancient texts have so much more to reveal to those willing to listen. The Watchers await those who seek them in the pages of forgotten manuscripts and crumbling tablets. Their names echo still across the ages and through the centuries. Good night, everyone, and pleasant dreams. Sleep well.